Bona tarda. Disculpin per no hablar catalán y tampoco voy a hablar en castellano porque probablemente es mejor de hablar en inglés en Cataluña que hablar castellano en Cataluña, ¿no? Entonces, so we'll carry on in English. Thank you very much for the invitation. I shall be speaking. Shall I sit down? No, I think I'll stand. I'll be speaking on behalf of the Natural Environment Research Council, which is one of 7 research councils in the UK. And since this is being webcast and maybe being reported, I am talking on behalf of my own research council. I am not reflecting necessarily the views of any of the other research councils. But we do coordinate quite closely together, and our data about research inputs, the amount of money that is spent on research and collaborators, is becoming more and more shared. And our information about the research outputs and outcomes and impacts of our research is becoming more and more shared also, except in the case of outputs, we have one system that from January of next year will be providing the information about all of the outputs of 5 research councils, and the other 2 research councils will use a different system. But we are trying to do some coordination of those. The other thing I should mention that is potentially quite exciting is that from November of this year, we will launch a system called Gateways to Research, and that will be a system where we will list all of the grants, all of the money, all of the departments, all of the people, all of the abstracts, all of the publications from those grants for everything from the 7 research councils. So it'll be a single integrated research portal. And that portal, the information on it will be available through an API. So therefore, if you wanted to get information on any UK researcher that had at any time in the past 10 years, because we think we're going 8 years maybe, we're going back to 2005, then that information will be extractable through that portal. So that's a significant improvement that is happening for us. And also we will make that information available, searchable first, and then extractable in serif XML format, so it can be integrated with other systems. The things I was going to, maybe I will sit. I was going to talk about the need for research funders to have unique identifiers in terms of identifying funding organizations, reporting on the activities of those funding organizations, identifying the expertise of potential reviewers for funding applications. How can we share the knowledge about who would be a good reviewer, share that knowledge nationally, but also internationally when we're looking for reviewers. Because sometimes you find that in a particular field, it's difficult to find a reviewer who is not a co-author or a co-grant holder of a particular applicant. So to find someone that is independent, you need to go internationally to get that view. So sharing this information about expertise in given areas of science is very important. Also important are research facilities. By that I mean the aircraft, the ships, the cyclotrons, the shared infrastructure for research, and the owners and the managers of those facilities need to have a method of uniquely identifying people also, because they're interested in linking publications and outputs to the money that is spent on those facilities, because they all have to justify the amount of money. If we run an aircraft, we have to show how many scientific papers and how many citations come from the use of equipment that is mounted on that aircraft. So all that's very important. We all share the interest then of capturing information about outputs and also the impacts, the downstream impacts of those publications, so on further funding and further research, patents, for example. Another very new area that we're looking at, and I'll talk about this in more detail, is the open access charges. I'll talk about that when we come to it specifically, but research research funders in the UK now are starting to place much stronger expectations upon researchers that any publication resulting from our grants should be made available open access. And the question of who pays for that charge is very important, and we would like to know, for example, in an international paper, is the UK paying more of the open access charges than Germany or some other country? So we need good metrics to be able to track that and follow that. And all that's important. You have to tie that back to identifying individuals and ORCID numbers. The other thing I mentioned is the importance of research careers. We've been talking about publications, but it's important also to track individual students, postdocs, academic staff, to track a research career and make sure that given areas of science you are producing the young scientists that will be available in 5 or 10 years' time to provide the academic expertise in that area that you need. So tracking the career of an individual right through from when they start to do a PhD to when they start to publish papers is important. And we've talked about, I don't know whether ORCID has looked at this in detail, because ORCID, I think, is mainly looking at staff members, but I think it's very necessary to find a mechanism of ensuring that your PhD students are registered for an ORCID number as early as possible in their careers. And then research classifications, I may have time to talk about. So I wanted to mention, from a perspective of funders, we have in the UK had a requirement since since 2008, we have had a requirement for that all our grant holders should acknowledge at the end of the paper, they should acknowledge funding from NERC, and then they should put the grant number should go in square brackets. And we signed an agreement with the publishers in 2008, and since then, the universities, the authors and the publishers have ignored the agreement really completely. This is quite a good example. So you can see, I got this information from Web of Science, and in Web of Science it allows you to search for funding agency, and Web of Science take the abstract at the end of a paper. From the information in that abstract, they will include the grant number where it is available, and they will also include the name of the funding organization. So in Web of Science, just for the past 3 years, for example, I found 65 papers which had one of the authors with a Barcelona address, and NERC was one of the funding organizations. So clearly there's a lot of cooperation going on between our two countries, and this was just one example of a paper in aquatic ecology. So this is the sort of thing that we would like to encourage. And Web of Science, Philip, great, nice to meet you. I've been talking to Philip before, but Thomson Reuters is very good because they make this information available on Web of Science, and it can be extracted into other Thomson Reuters products like Insights. So it's possible for me to do an analysis on papers produced using NERC funding at whatever university, and then look at the citation counts and the citation value of those publications compared to other countries or other funding organizations. So that's a significant, so that's my thank you to Thomson Reuters for doing that at the moment. So funding, identifying funders is important. Identifying funders is very important at a European level. As you know, there are many European initiatives, European Research Council, the Joint Research Centre, European Science Foundation, Science Europe. All these things need to know which country a particular person comes from. One thing I'll talk about on the next slide is ERAnets, because I think there has been a significant waste of effort in some aspects of the coordination that ERAnets go through. But there are also many European international collaborations at the institute to institute. So one that I know well is PEER, for example, which is the Pan-European Environmental Research Collaborative, which the equivalent of the Government Environmental Research Centre collaborate in that way. So in all of them, they need to have good information on the researchers and the outputs from those researchers. The publication databases you'll know well. Cordis is good at giving indication about European research grants. It's not good at linking those research grants to outputs, which is where OpenAIR comes in. And OpenAIR is seeking to establish metadata standards for the recording of the grant, of the funding organization, and of the grant number. So they are seeking to coordinate with European repositories in introducing a metadata standard with which that information should be reproduced. Unfortunately, at the moment, the standard that they've introduced is very focused on the particular requirements of a European grant. So there's a lot of semantic information built into the European grant. If you see a European, it says FP6, and then it gives the name of the program, and then it gives the name of the grant, all separated by slashes. So one of the things that the funders are seeking to do is to work with OpenAIR and come up with a generic metadata format which repositories can use that makes it easier to share not just information about European funding, European Union funding, but any national or international funding. And clearly the links between the funding organization and the data sets produced by that research are very important as well. So metadata standards on recording data sets are crucial. I just show you this, it's not complete. This one should go down to, I think in total there are about 105 ERANETs. ERANETs are a system which was introduced in Framework Program 6, and then continued in 7. And it gives money to funding organizations to coordinate their own research calls, research programs in particular thematic areas. But what has happened is in each of those, such as Biblioteca, which was one that I was involved in, 15 different European organizations send a list of all of the grants which they produce, and a database is produced of all of these grants. If you multiply those 15 or 20 countries cooperating on each of these projects by 100 projects, you have a huge amount of duplication of effort and a huge amount of overlap of effort, because many of the grants might be applicable to several different ERANETs. So my point is that I think Europe, through the sort of thing that OpenAIR is doing, through having a single database which collects information about all outputs deriving from research funded by European funding organizations, rather than having 100 duplicates of that. And the problem with ERANETs is the funding comes for 5 years, and then at the end of that you've built a database and there's no money to continue it, and it collapses and it's worse than useless. Sorry, I hope there's nobody from the European Union listening. So therefore, in the UK, not only is there a problem about identifying, and every country, I'm sure, not only is there a problem about identifying individuals, identifying academics, but also there is sometimes a problem about identifying or deciding what is a valid research organization. So it's not too bad with higher education institutions or universities. There are 164 of those that the research councils give funding to. But sometimes we get a school of something, a school of tropical medicine, for example, will come along and say, we're not really part of this university. We have a loose association, but we're not really part of them. Can you send the money to us, please, and not to the headquarters of the university? Sometimes a bit difficult to know and then that's good because they get to keep the overhead, and the overhead money doesn't go to the big university. There's also a list of independent research organizations. We produce this list depending upon set criteria about whether they're eligible to get funding from the government, but we produce that list. And then there are 4 of the research councils, including NERC, run their own research institutions, so a little bit like CSIC, which is many institutions throughout the country. So we will give them grants, competitively awarded grants, as well as a block grant for the core research that they do. So therefore there is a problem identifying research organizations. It's becoming more difficult because increasingly we are giving funding to research institutions in developing countries. and it's very difficult to know what a bona fide research organization in a developing country is. So we have sometimes problems with that. And that's just the problem with research organizations. When we then ask them to say what university or what research department they come from, that is horrifically difficult, because I don't know if it happens in Spain the same way, but we don't have physics departments or chemistry departments or biology departments anymore. They've all changed to grandiose titles that sound better and are better for getting funding. It's very difficult to know what the School of Environment, for example, in Lancaster University is mainly about geology, the school, whereas in East Anglia it's about biology, so it's very hard to do that. So that's a problem that funders we have. I'm just showing this as perhaps one way forward for identifying institutions is to use more the participant identification code. So every legal entity which wants to get money from the European Union must apply for one of these codes, and it's verified. So the Natural Environment Research Council has this participant identification code, our address, and it's verified through the VAT number. So maybe that's something that ORCID could, well, I don't know, but ORCID could think of, or Martin's shaking his head, but so, because ORCID you will have to know what an institution, if an institution, okay, you're not, all right. So ORCID is doing no verification of anything. You can set up as an institution, you can say you've got academics, and nobody will worry about whether you exist. Is that right?
So this is a big problem that somebody else has to solve.
Okay. So identifying reviewers, clearly, as I said, it's something we have to do. We're doing this in two ways. We're asking reviewers to identify their own skills and competence using a three-level hierarchy of expertise in all areas of science, which which 6 of the 7 research councils share. And then we're also starting to look at taxonomic matching. So looking at the abstract of an application that comes in, and then doing a text-based matching or text-based fingerprinting of the scientific themes in that application against the publications of any author that we think might be relevant. So I think we're going to need those two sorts of approaches. But both of them need good identification, good and unique identification of who the individual scientists that we're looking at. Research facilities are another area. The Natural Environment Research Council, but also the Science Technologies and Facilities Council, which is mainly physics, and the Medical Research Council provide a large amount of equipment and shared central facilities. So as I said, we need to track the outputs from those facilities. We need to be particularly careful about international collaboration with those facilities, because sometimes there are barter schemes. So if one UK researcher gets time on a UK facility, then we have a scheme with another country, with a research council in another country, that will allow them in turn to go to the facility in that country. So we need very good statistics on that, and we need to identify the scientists very clearly. We also do give an indication to, Amanda was mentioning earlier, the research excellence framework, which is the mechanism which the Higher Education Funding Council, which is the main bit of government that gives money to the universities for their core research. That is based on, as Amanda was saying, that's based on your academic track record, and it's very important, and it's like a war. The universities plan for this years in advance, and their whole strategy is built on the best possible submission. So one area in which we do contribute to that is by showing the cash equivalent of any time on a ship or a cyclotron or an aircraft that your researchers have won. We convert that into the number of hours and the cost of each hour and give that back, and it counts as part of the contribution to research which that particular academic and that particular department have won. And it can be quite a large sum of money, even in relation to the total research grant. So the last message there is that for facilities, we need to link people to the grants, to the use of the facility, and to the data produced by that facility. So the metadata has to be shared. Research outputs, I was mentioning that up at the top there's something called ROS, which is the Research Outcomes System, which is currently used by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the Biology and Biotechnology Research Council, the Economic and Social Research Council, and the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. Those are the three abbreviations, and then NERC will join that next year. And then another system which is used by the Medical Research Council and the Science and Technology Facilities Council. Now every grant holder is obliged each year to show not only the publications that they produce, but a range of other things like staff training and the impact of their research. They're supposed to write text about the impact on policy, on business, on charity, on the third sector, on charities, and many things. It's very complicated, probably too complicated and too comprehensive, but it exists. So we have now a lot of information about impact. Sorry, I just mentioned that that's not to stop us doing, we recently produced this publication about the bibliometric evidence for the excellence of science funded by our research council, produced for us by Evidence Limited, which is a branch of Thomson Reuters. So as well as the new impact studies of the submissions from the researchers, we also look at the impact of the publications using objective indices. I say there that it would be very nice to integrate ORCID into our research outcome system in some way, and I think it all comes down to money, so we need to talk about how much a funding organisation will have to pay to join ORCID. Oh yeah, sorry, I'd listed, these are all the types of inputs that we expect academics to make an annual record of. And it can be more frequent than annual, but at least annual. And the other very interesting and challenging area is open access. Research Councils UK, which is a body that combines all 7 of the research councils, has published recently a new open access policy, which says that any grant holder must make publications deriving from that grant available effectively either gold open access or green open access. But the green, we say that it has to be the author's final version, so we're not interested in it. We don't count anything which is the preprint, for example. Anything that is the initial version submitted by the author, we're not counting that as being validly green open access. And similarly, we've sought to set limitations on the embargo period. So for, and this is very similar to open air. In fact, it's identical to open air. So in the arts and the humanities and economics, we've said the embargo period can be 12 months. In all other areas of science, the embargo period is 6 months. So at the moment, we're having animated discussions with the publishers about this, and there are very animated discussions in the green open access world who think that RCUK is a traitor to the green scheme, if you like. And we can have a discussion about that afterwards. There's a lot of problems. And the other very important thing about our stipulation is the copyright with which the paper should be made available, because we are stipulating CC BY, which means effectively as long as you acknowledge it, anybody can use it, and you can reuse it, and you can search, you can do data mining. And that's an issue for some of the publishers, not others. So what else? Oh yes. So what I'm saying in the second bullet point is that the publishers I think given that the funders are increasingly realizing that we will have to, in order to stimulate this system, that we will be giving some additional money to the universities and to the grant holders, I think there then becomes an obligation on the publishers to do better with the dissemination of the metadata in a standard format. So I don't know whether you've ever tried to find the number of open access papers published in hybrid journals. So it's fine in any of the PLOS publications where you can immediately see that a paper is open access, but when it's in a hybrid journal, it's getting better, but it's often very difficult to know whether it's being paid for or not. Particularly if your university has a subscription to that journal anyway, you can't check whether you're having access to that paper because it's being prepaid or whether it's being paid by your subscription. So we're hoping that the universities, that the publishers will have a standard flag that they can put into Crossref at the same time that they get the DOI allocated to it, and that things like Web of Science and Scopus, you'll be able immediately to be able to see whether you need a subscription for that article or whether you can actually access it openly. Some publishers do this, but others don't. And similarly, we hope that Crossref will start to hold better information about the funder name and the grant number. Already there's an initiative in Crossref called FundRef, which is working with a number of organizations, and Elsevier in this case is providing the list of funding organizations. So we see that as an important thing going forward. And the other thing is that I think a lot of repositories, the last bullet point is saying that if I look at Driver, I don't know many repository whether you will know Driver, but Driver is a European mechanism for integrating the metadata held in individual repositories throughout Europe. Driver is quite good because it allows a faceted search, so at least you're able to search for the contributor field and you can find sponsor. But usually most repositories don't use those metadata fields, so there's a need for a standardization of the exposure of metadata fields and an extension of Dublin Core to take in some additional fields about funder and additional fields about open access. And that's something that needs to be coordinated not at a UK level, but at a European level for all institutional managers in Europe to use. Right, last two slides. Oh, no. Third last slide, I beg your pardon. This is just the point that I was making about tracking the career of researchers. There are a number of European initiatives, for example, the More2 project that are looking at the mobility of researchers. Certainly in the UK, we have a problem. There is something called a unique staff identifier, and every university holds that, and it's maintained by a central organization, but it's maintained in secret by that organization. So when a member of staff moves from one university to another university, what they are supposed to do is to ask the previous university what is the unique staff identifier of this person that is moved. And then they take that unique secret number and they put it into their own system. In practice, they never do that. When someone moves one university to another, they get another unique staff identifier. So the particular person has many unique identifiers and the system breaks down. So we need ORCID, not just for publications, we need ORCID to track staff. So this slide, Amanda was mentioning before, the question is how many researchers are there in Europe? This is looking at Europe of the 27, and it's looking at statistics from Eurostat. So these are statistics provided by each national ministry that has responsibility for research. And they are expected to provide information in 3 categories. The one at the bottom here is the number of government researchers, and the one above that is the number of university researchers, and this is business. So you see in the UK, for example, I don't know whether it's true, but our government says we have a very small number, only 4% or something of researchers are employed by government. That depends how they define government, because each country will do that. And we have a huge number of people in universities and a very small number of researchers working in business, whereas in Germany, of course, with such a good industry, many more in government, but a huge number of researchers working in industry. So that's the challenge for ORCID, I guess. I mean, ORCID is fine when you look at universities, and maybe when you look at government, but how do we track the researchers working in industry? Presumably we just let them all self-claim a number. And the last question is how many researchers there are in Europe. Again, Greece is down as 0 because these are statistics collected by Eurostat, and Greece hasn't made a submission for the past 3 years. But ignoring Greece, we see that 21% of the researchers are in Germany, UK and France about equal in 15, and Spain is 9%. So Spain has 2% more researchers than Italy, for example. But either way, the figure there is 1.54 million researchers according to Eurostat figures in Europe of the 27. So that's a challenge for ORCID, I think. Okay, that's me. Thank you.
Yeah, you made a very interesting point towards the end, and this number also reflects that 1.54 million researchers in Europe. And if you aggregated all the industry researchers, my understanding of the ORCID is aimed more towards the scholarly researchers and the academia in terms of providing the ORCID ID. You also said that you invited ORCID to look into this industry researcher. I mean, is there a plan in the future to, well, I'm not very confident about how a company or in an industry is going to share their patenting activity because it's so competitive and commercial. And this is a big number of, if you aggregated all the business blue boxes, probably they will eat up more than 50% of
30 maybe. 40,
is there some kind of a marriage that might happen which will spin off into some eventual benefit at some point in time?
Well, I don't know if I can answer that, but certainly all of the funders are very interested in any information that they can get about collaboration with business, and I'm sure funding organizations in every country have special schemes that we try to encourage university academics to work with industry. So any information that we can get is very important. We're also worried, we won't be evident here, but we're a little bit worried that some of the major commercial companies in Europe are actually going to China and to Brazil and to India. Much of the research is done there where it's cheaper, and it's very difficult to get an indication on that. So I think tracking the health of researchers in business is just as important as tracking it in academia. Whether ORCID, but I mean ORCID clearly you just expect the individual researcher, if they produce a paper and they happen to work for a commercial company, you expect them to register themselves individually. There's nothing in your business model to cater for Physons or ICI or Siemens or whatever to register, or is there?
No, I think in theory ORCID is open to every organization, but I think ORCID is more about connecting researchers to research outputs. So ORCID isn't really helpful in finding out how many researchers there are in Europe, and if a business isn't really interested in making research outputs public, then there's no reason for them to sign up as ORCID member, which is probably true for patents, not so much for publications. But it's really up to the businesses. It's probably not hasn't been the main focus right now, but there's no reason why they shouldn't be part of this.
Hi, Gerald. Thank you for the speech. I think that figure of 1.5 could increase a lot more if you take in headcounts instead of FTE.
Yeah.
That will grow to 8 million. So, well, according to Eurostat, it's the same source, 8 million.